The alien warship Kivera drifted silently through the vast expanse of space, its sleek hull reflecting the light of distant stars, as if it were a predator lurking in the dark. The bridge was alive with the hum of advanced technology screens blinking with streams of data, and a low murmur of voices from various officers. The Admiral of the Ysera fleet stood motionless at the observation deck, his long black tendrils quivering slightly as he focused on a single sight displayed on a screen before him. It was a human child barely 12 years old seated in front of the most advanced Starship simulator the galaxy had ever known. At first glance, the scene seemed almost trivial, a child in a room filled with technology far beyond their comprehension trying to steer a digital ship through a mock battle with nothing but a pair of hands and a joystick. Yet something caught the Admiral's attention as the child's fingers flew over the controls. There was no hesitation, no fumbling. There was only the pure focus of a mind unburdened by the complexities of the technology surrounding it. The Admiral watched the child's movements grow more fluid and precise with each passing moment. The simulation unfolded like a dance. The child guided the virtual starship through an asteroid field with an agility that made no sense. The ship's path was erratic yet somehow calculated, as though the child could see the future of the battle long before it arrived. Every turn was a step in a grand design, each movement a note in an unwritten melody. The Admiral studied the child's every gesture, wondering how such an inexperienced mind could seem so in tune with the rhythm of space. The Kivera**'s computer systems hummed as they tracked the movements of the human child. Deep analysis algorithms engaged, running hundreds of simulations trying to figure out the secret to this unnatural dexterity. Yet no pattern emerged. None of the usual protocols for learning combat tactics or spatial awareness could explain what the Admiral was witnessing. This wasn't just a game. This was something else, something deeper than simple skill or reflexes. As the simulation progressed, the child's confidence grew. The Admiral could see the change in their posture, the way they leaned into the controls with a quiet intensity. The digital foes they faced seemed to become more real with each encounter, and yet the child reacted without fear, without panic. They weren't just responding to the simulation, they were shaping it, rewriting its rules, as if they could bend the very fabric of the virtual universe to their will. The Admiral's tendrils twitched again, and he felt something stir within him, something that had not been stirred in a long time, a feeling of genuine curiosity, something far beyond his usual dispassionate calculations. This human child was not simply playing the game, they were dissecting it, understanding it on a level that should have been impossible for one so young and so untrained. The Admiral leaned forward, his mind racing with questions he had never thought to ask before. How could this child know what they knew? How could their instinct be so finely honed? How could such raw potential exist in such a small package? The child's ship dodged another barrage of fire, effortlessly twisting and turning with a grace that belied their age and experience. And as the Admiral watched them continue their game, his thoughts turned inward. In the quiet of the bridge, he began to wonder just how much he had underestimated the human race, perhaps far more than he cared to admit. The Admiral's eyes narrowed as the child's ship moved with unyielding precision through the increasingly chaotic battlefield. In the simulator, the digital enemies grew more numerous and aggressive, their weapons firing in rapid succession from every direction. The Admiral expected the child to falter any moment now. Surely the odds were too much, even for a seasoned pilot, but the child showed no sign of slowing, no hesitation in their actions. The small human's hands danced across the controls, as if they were part of the ship itself, responding with uncanny timing and reflexes. The Admiral leaned in closer, his tendrils brushing against the glass of the observation deck, his gaze fixed on the child's every movement. He had witnessed thousands of battles, fought by experienced warriors across countless species in his lifetime. Yet he had never seen anything like this. The child's actions weren't just strategic, they were intuitive. The way they avoided incoming fire by mere fractions of a second was something he had only seen in the most seasoned of combatants, not a child playing a game. And yet this human seemed to possess that same instinctual grasp of the battlefield that some of the finest tacticians in the galaxy demonstrated. The Admiral's mind raced through a series of calculations, analyzing the child's movements in real time. Each turn of the joystick, each shift in their body language was another piece of the puzzle, and yet the Admiral could not figure out what the child was doing. It wasn't just about raw speed or accuracy. There was a deeper understanding at play, something more elemental, as if the child could see the battle unfolding before it even began. The simulation began to change. The digital enemies adapted to the child's tactics, shifting their formations in real time in an attempt to overwhelm the young pilot. It was a clever move designed to force the child into a corner, and yet instead of panicking, the child's movements became even more fluid, more deliberate. They responded to each change in the enemy's strategy, as if they had already anticipated it. It was almost as if the child had tapped into a deeper layer of perception, one that was beyond even the Admiral's advanced systems to predict. The Admiral stared at the screen in stunned silence. The child's ship now weaved effortlessly through waves of fire, dodging attacks with a level of grace that seemed almost impossible for their age and experience. With every passing second, the Admiral felt his initial skepticism slipping away. This was no longer a simple game of strategy or reflexes. It was a performance, a showcase of something far more complex than anything he had anticipated. He had thought of humans as a simple species. In many ways, their technology was young, their understanding of the universe limited by comparison to the ancient civilizations that spanned the galaxy. But in this moment, the Admiral could see something different. There was a hidden strength in these creatures, a force that didn't rely on the things most other species valued, the things that he had spent his life studying. Their understanding of tactics and combat was not based on rigid rules or technology, but on something deeper, something more unpredictable and yet oddly effective. The Admiral's thoughts were interrupted as the child's ship broke through the final wave of enemies. The simulation ended with a soft chime, and the screen went dark, but the Admiral remained still, his eyes locked on the empty cockpit where the child sat undisturbed, their focus unwavering. He realized then that this child had just proven something far beyond a simple victory in a virtual game. This was the beginning of something much more profound. The Admiral stood still, his tendrils stiff and alert. As the simulation ended, the human child had completed the impossible task, and yet the Admiral's mind churned with questions he could not ignore. This wasn't just skill or luck. This was something more. The child had reacted with an instinctive brilliance that felt almost alien to him, a child with no formal training, outmaneuvering enemies far more powerful and sophisticated than anything they should have been able to face. For a long moment, the Admiral watched as the child stood from the console, their face expressionless, but there was something in their eyes, a glimmer of quiet satisfaction, but not pride, not the look of someone who had simply won a game. No, there was something deeper, as if the victory itself was not the point, but the challenge, the process of understanding how to overcome it. That was what had mattered. The Admiral had seen warriors fight for glory, conquer foes for personal gain, but this child had fought to understand the battle itself, to master it, not to prove a point, but to expand their own limitations. The Admiral issued a command, and the doors to the simulator opened. The child stepped out and walked towards the waiting crew with the same quiet determination they had shown in the cockpit. The Admiral found himself at a loss for words as he regarded the small human now standing before him, a being no taller than a youngling of his own species, yet capable of something that defied his understanding. "You did well," the Admiral said, his voice deep and measured. Though his words were meant as praise, there was an underlying curiosity that had yet to be addressed. He wasn't sure what to ask first. How could he begin to understand what this child had just done? He had watched countless beings fight in simulations and in real battles, but he had never seen one who approached combat like this human. The Admiral had studied tactics for centuries. He knew everything about strategy and war, but this child had simply known in ways that defied logic. The child met his gaze with a calm that unsettled him. They said nothing at first, simply stood there looking up at the Admiral with an expression of quiet contemplation. It was a look that suggested the child already understood something he did not. "How did you do it?" the Admiral finally asked, his voice softer now. "How did you predict their moves?" His question was not just about the simulation itself, but about the deeper layers of intuition that the child had exhibited. The child blinked once, and then replied in a simple tone, I didn't predict them, I just reacted to what I felt was coming." Their voice was soft, but there was an undeniable confidence in the way they spoke, as though this was a matter of fact, not a mystery at all. "I guess I just trust what my mind and body know even when I don't have all the answers." The Admiral's tendrils twitched as his thoughts spiraled. He had always believed that knowledge and calculation were the most important aspects of combat, but here was a child suggesting that trust in one's instincts could be more important than any calculation, that there was an entire realm of understanding that couldn't be measured or predicted, only felt, and that this was what had guided the child through the battle with a level of mastery he had never seen. It was almost as if the child had tapped into something primal, a connection to the universe itself that was beyond the grasp of even the most advanced species. The Admiral's mind raced to process this new revelation, but he couldn't deny the truth of what he had seen. The child had not just played the game, they had lived it in a way that made no sense to any logical being. The Admiral took a step back and looked at the child anew. This was not the simple young human he had expected to observe. This was something else, something far more dangerous and far more intriguing than he had ever anticipated. The Admiral studied the child in silence, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts. The simulation was over, yet the child had left something far more profound behind in its wake. It wasn't just the ability to handle a Starship simulator. No, this was something else. Something instinctive, something raw. The Admiral had seen countless species, each with their own strengths, their own ways of thinking and reacting. But what he had witnessed from this child was different. There was no calculation to this, no rigid formula to follow. There was only pure, unfiltered action and an almost impossible sense of awareness. "Your mind works in ways I have never encountered," the Admiral said quietly, his tone now laced with a mix of admiration and something else he couldn't quite place. "You don't just play the game, do you? You become it." The child stood still, their gaze never wavering from the Admiral. It was as though they had known all along that the Admiral's focus would shift from the simulation to them. The Admiral's words hung in the air for a moment before the child replied, their voice calm yet unwavering. "I don't think about the game. I just focus on what's in front of me. Every move feels like it's already there, waiting to happen. It's like my hands and the ship are connected, like I can feel the way things are going before they even start." The Admiral blinked, processing the simplicity of the child's words. Could it really be that straightforward? That a being could experience battle, not through the complex calculations of tactics, but through intuition. He had never encountered a species with this kind of capability. There was always a logical structure, a well-planned series of actions. Yet this child, this human, had surpassed any traditional understanding of strategy in ways that even the most advanced simulation programs couldn't replicate. The Admiral knew that he had to see more. He had to understand what made this child tick. Perhaps, he thought, there was more to the human race than their simple and straightforward nature. What if their true power wasn't in their technology or their physical prowess, but in something far deeper? The ability to trust instinct, to feel the battlefield in a way that no machine or artificial intelligence could. "I want to see more," the Admiral said finally, his voice steady but with an edge of unspoken urgency. "The next simulation, I want you to face more. Much more." The child nodded, unfazed. They walked back to the simulator without hesitation, as though the Admiral's command was merely another step in their unending exploration. The Admiral watched as the child sat down, adjusted the controls with practiced ease, and powered up the system. The interface glowed to life, and the next round of the simulation began. This time, however, the Admiral had something different in mind. He'd noticed the child's resilience in the face of pressure, but now he wanted to test their limits. He wanted to see how the child would handle a truly overwhelming scenario, one designed to break even the most seasoned pilots. The simulation would adapt in real time, creating an onslaught of enemies with every passing moment, changing environments and tactics on the fly. This would push the child to the brink. As the simulation unfolded, the Admiral's eyes narrowed with a new level of scrutiny. The child's hands moved again, dancing over the controls, each gesture calm, assured. This time, the enemies were more numerous, more aggressive. The battle was chaotic, unpredictable, and unrelenting. The Admiral's sensors monitored the simulation with a high degree of precision, anticipating what would come next. But as the virtual battlefield erupted around the child, the Admiral's focus shifted once again to the child's movements. The ship jerked, dodged, and weaved through fire, as though the child could sense the attacks coming before they even began. Each maneuver was so smooth, so fluid, that it seemed as though the child was not reacting to the simulation but guiding it, like a master sculptor shaping a block of stone. The Admiral's heart began to race. He had seen no less than 10 battle scenarios, just like this one, all with much more advanced pilots, and none had been able to execute a strategy that would counter this overwhelming force. But the child was doing it, effortlessly, as if they were moving to the rhythm of some silent music that only they could hear. The enemies closed in, and the Admiral watched, mesmerized, as the child slipped through the onslaught with an almost unnatural grace. This was no longer a simple game. It was a performance, a manifestation of something he could not entirely understand. And yet, in that moment, as the child's ship continued to evade fire and retaliate with unmatched precision, the Admiral realized something that sent a chill down his spine. This child, this seemingly simple human, was not just surviving the impossible. They were rewriting the very rules of battle itself. The battle raged on in the simulator, and the Admiral's eyes never left the child as the ship darted through incoming waves of enemy fire. With an almost eerie grace, the onslaught of enemy ships and laser blasts filled the virtual space around the child's vessel, but there was no sign of fear in the child's movements. No hesitation, no panic, only an innate flow that defied logic and surpassed expectation. It was as if the child had become one with the battle itself. Their every decision seemed predestined, as if they were responding to something deeper than mere strategy, something that went beyond their limited understanding of technology. The Admiral's mind raced faster than the simulation itself. The sensors in the observation room were running at full capacity as they tracked every movement, every adjustment in real time. The enemies grew in number and strength, yet the child remained unfazed. Each wave of fire was met with a response that should have been impossible. The simulator's systems predicted the child would falter, would fall apart under the weight of the virtual assault, but they did not. Instead, the child's movements became more precise, more attuned to the battlefield, as though they could sense the changes before they came and adapted seamlessly. The Admiral had seen countless simulations and real battles throughout his career, but nothing had prepared him for this. He had always relied on his intellect, his experience, and his systems to anticipate the outcome of any conflict. But this human child was operating on an entirely different plane. Their ability to adapt and overcome wasn't based on learned tactics or calculations. It was something else entirely, something far more unpredictable, far more dangerous than anything he had ever encountered. It was then that the Admiral made a decision. He would test the child further. He would push them to the absolute limit to see if this was truly a fluke, or if the child's capabilities were something more fundamental, something that could change the course of an entire war. With a flick of his tendrils, the Admiral initiated a new sequence in the simulation, a new challenge, something he knew would overwhelm even the most experienced pilots. The virtual battlefield shifted, and the enemies began to multiply exponentially. The child's ship now faced an impossible number of foes, an entire armada designed specifically to crush any resistance. The odds were astronomical. The simulation system warned that the challenge would be fatal. Yet the child's fingers moved with a practiced ease, undeterred by the overwhelming number of enemies surrounding them. The Admiral could feel the tension building in the air as the child's ship weaved through fire, dodging incoming attacks at the last possible moment, retaliating with devastating precision, as if they had already planned out every move before it even happened. The child was not simply reacting, they were directing the battle in ways that the simulation could not have anticipated. The Admiral's heart began to race as he observed the impossible unfolding before him. He had watched warriors who had trained their entire lives to fight with precision and calculation, yet none of them had the child's ability to think beyond the program to bend the battlefield to their will. It wasn't just a matter of reflex or strategy. The child had an uncanny sense of timing, a deep understanding of the flow of battle that transcended the limits of the simulation itself. Minutes passed, and the enemies continued to close in, but the child's ship remained unharmed. The Admiral's sensors showed no signs of failure, no sign of hesitation. The child continued to fight on, like a force of nature, moving with a clarity that made no sense in the face of overwhelming odds. And then, just when it seemed that the battle had reached its peak, something shifted. The child's ship performed a maneuver so audacious, so unexpected, that even the Admiral's highly sophisticated systems could not predict it. They dove straight into the heart of the enemy formation, spinning and twisting in midair before emerging from the chaos unscathed, leaving destruction in their wake. The simulation ended with a soft chime, and the digital battlefield faded away, but the Admiral's mind was still racing. His tendrils twitched in agitation as he stared at the empty simulator cockpit where the child had just performed the impossible. He had seen it with his own eyes, and yet he still couldn't believe it. This child had done something that defied every principle he had ever studied, every battle plan he had ever known. They had shattered the very foundation of what he thought was possible, and now the Admiral realized something profound. This child wasn't just a brilliant strategist or a talented pilot. They were something far more dangerous, a harbinger of an unpredictable force that could shift the course of history itself. The Admiral stood motionless, his thoughts still reeling as the child stepped out of the simulator, their face calm and composed, as if they had merely completed another routine exercise. But the Admiral knew better. The child's performance had revealed something far greater than just their skill. It had revealed a fundamental truth about humanity that had been hidden from his kind until now, something that would force him to reevaluate everything he had thought he knew about them. The child stepped out of the simulator, their expressions still calm, as if the impossible battle they had just fought was little more than a game. The Admiral stood in silence, his eyes fixed on the child. He had watched in awe as the simulation unfolded, witnessed a performance that shattered all his expectations, and yet, standing before him now, the child seemed completely unaffected. It was as though they had not just outmaneuvered the simulation, but had completely transcended it. The Admiral's mind raced as he tried to make sense of what he had witnessed. How could a being so young possess such an uncanny understanding of combat, of strategy, of everything? You, the Admiral began, his voice barely more than a whisper. You didn't just fight that battle. You became it. The child looked up at him, eyes bright but not cocky, not prideful. Just quiet. A faint smile tugged at the corner of their lips, a subtle acknowledgement of the Admiral's words, but not the kind of smile that suggested a boast. It was as if the child knew something the Admiral didn't, a deeper truth about themselves and the battle they had just fought. I didn't really think about it, the child replied, their voice steady but soft. I just let it happen. It's like, the more you fight the flow, the harder it is. So I just stopped thinking and focused on feeling. The Admiral's tendrils twitched again, his thoughts a storm of conflicting ideas. He had seen countless warriors, many of them highly skilled in their tactics, trained for their entire lives to command vast fleets, engage in complex battles, and emerge victorious. But none had exhibited this kind of mastery, this ability to sense, to feel the battlefield as if they were one with it. It was a kind of instinct, yes, but also something far more profound. The Admiral couldn't help but think that this child had tapped into something older, something primal, something that even his advanced species had never quite grasped. How do you explain that? The Admiral asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. What made you act like that? You faced overwhelming odds and still. I didn't think of the odds, the child interrupted gently. I didn't think of the enemies. I just reacted to what felt right. I trust my instincts. The Admiral stared at the child, his mind struggling to comprehend the depth of their words. Trust instincts. It seemed so simple, but it was something the Admiral had never fully understood. His people, the Yizara, were an ancient species, their society built on intellect, precision, and calculated strategies. To rely solely on instinct, on feeling, seemed like madness. But the child was proving him wrong. The child's ability to react without thinking, to trust in their own instincts, had carried them through the most impossible of situations. The Admiral found himself leaning forward, his interest piqued in a way he had not felt in centuries. This was no longer about understanding a human child. This was about understanding something else, a force that he could not measure, not predict, not even begin to comprehend. What was it about humanity that allowed them to embrace the unknown, to trust the unquantifiable, in ways that no other species had ever dared? I have seen thousands of soldiers, the Admiral said slowly, his voice heavy with thought, but none like you. None who move with such purpose. What do you think sets humans apart? The child seemed to ponder the question, their gaze wandering for a moment as if they were reflecting on something deeply personal. Finally, they spoke again, their voice still soft but carrying a weight that made the Admiral's heart stir. We're not perfect, the child said, but we keep going. We keep learning. And even when we fail, we try again. I guess. We never stop believing that we can figure it out. That's what makes us different. The Admiral stood there, silent, for a long moment. What the child had just said, those simple yet powerful words, struck at the core of everything he had been trained to believe. The Yizara believed in perfection, in calculated success, in never leaving anything to chance. But the human child's words made him wonder if perhaps the true strength of a species wasn't in their ability to avoid failure, but in their ability to face it, learn from it, and keep pushing forward in spite of it. The Admiral took a deep breath, his mind finally quieting, and in that moment, he understood. This human child, this small, unassuming figure, had shown him something that his entire life of study and strategy had failed to reveal. It wasn't about being the strongest, or the smartest, or the most technologically advanced. It was about the to continue, to adapt, and to never give up. The Admiral knew now that he could not view humanity the same way again. They were not a species to be measured by their failures or their victories. They were something else entirely. And as he watched the child, standing before him with a quiet certainty, the Admiral realized that humanity was a force that could not be ignored. A force that, if left unchecked, might just change the galaxy in ways he could never predict. The Admiral stood before the child, his mind still racing from everything he had witnessed. The quiet confidence radiating from the small human in front of him was unlike anything he had ever encountered. The universe, vast and filled with countless species, each with its own set of rules, had always seemed like an ordered, predictable place. But this human, with their unyielding faith in their ability to adapt, to learn, to keep going no matter the odds, was a wild card, a force that could unravel everything he had believed about the natural order of things. His tendrils twitched restlessly as he considered the implications of what he had just witnessed. Humanity was not simply a young, unrefined species. They were unpredictable, adaptive, and deeply resilient. They thrived on challenge, on overcoming adversity, on the very essence of struggle itself. The Admiral felt something shift within him. It wasn't fear, not exactly, but something close. An awareness of a potential threat, not from weapons or technology, but from something far more dangerous. A mindset that could break the rules of war, of survival, of the galaxy itself. For a moment, he thought about the greater consequences of this child's abilities. What if this was not just a rare case? What if the human race as a whole shared this capacity for growth, for resilience, for pushing beyond the limits? What would that mean for the Yizara, for his fleet, for all the species who had lived in the shadows of their long-established dominance? We are not like your people, the child said, their voice steady as they broke through his spiraling thoughts. The Admiral looked down at them, surprised by the calmness of their words. We're not perfect. We make mistakes all the time. But we never stop learning. The child's words struck him harder than they should have. He realized then that the child had understood something deeper than even he had realized. This was not an attack, not a declaration of superiority. This was simply the child acknowledging the raw, inherent nature of humanity, imperfection balanced by an unyielding desire to improve, to survive, to thrive. Do you think your people will conquer the galaxy? The Admiral asked, his voice surprisingly soft. The child looked up at him, and there was no hesitation in their response. We don't seek to conquer, but we will never stop pushing forward. We'll make mistakes, but we'll find a way. And one day, we'll stand alongside everyone else, not to rule, but to help, to learn, to grow together. The Admiral's mind churned with the weight of their words. If what the child said was true, if humans were as adaptable as they appeared, then the very foundation of galactic power could be shaken. For centuries, the Ys-Era had dominated, not through brute force alone, but through a methodical, calculated approach to everything. Their superiority had been founded on their intellect, their ability to outthink and outmaneuver. But now, facing this human child, the Admiral was beginning to question everything. The child's ship had danced through impossible odds, relying not on pre-programmed strategies or overwhelming firepower, but on something raw, something intuitive. It had shattered the rules of engagement that even the Admiral had taken for granted. And now the child spoke of their people not as conquerors, but as survivors, as learners, as equals who had yet to find their place but were determined to make their mark on the universe. The Admiral knew the importance of what had just transpired. This child had shown him the future of humanity, a future that was not defined by their lack of experience or their current technology, but by their potential to adapt, to grow, and to innovate in ways that could challenge everything the galaxy had known. For a long moment, neither the Admiral nor the child spoke. The silence was heavy, almost oppressive, as both seemed to come to the same realization. The universe was about to change, whether the Ys-Era were ready for it or not. Finally, the Admiral broke the silence. You're right, he said, his voice low. You are unlike anything I've seen before. And perhaps that is exactly what this galaxy needs. The child tilted their head slightly, as if considering his words, but said nothing. It was as if they knew that there was no need for further explanation. The future, for better or worse, would be shaped by the things they could not predict. And perhaps, just perhaps, humanity would be the one to guide the galaxy into an era of change, one where instinct, resilience, and adaptability would rule. The Admiral turned to leave, but before he did, he glanced back at the child one last time. There was something in the way they stood there, so small yet so assured, that reminded him of something he had long forgotten. That the most dangerous forces in the universe were not always the strongest or the most advanced, but the ones who were willing to learn, to grow, to change. Humanity was a force he had underestimated. And now he was no longer sure if it was something he could afford to ignore. The Admiral's mind lingered on the child as he walked away, the finality of the encounter settling around him like a weight he couldn't quite lift. The ship's corridors seemed to stretch endlessly before him, a reflection of the vastness of the questions now swirling in his head. What had he learned from this meeting? What did it mean for the future of the galaxy? He had spent centuries studying warfare, tactics, and the balance of power. He had watched countless species rise and fall, analyzing every move, every failure, every victory. He had always believed that knowledge, preparation, and superior intellect were the keys to success. And yet, what he had seen in that simulation was something beyond knowledge, beyond intellect. It was the human child's ability to sense the ebb and flow of battle with nothing but raw instinct. It was an unpredictable force that defied all logic and calculation, and it was that very unpredictability that filled the Admiral with both awe and trepidation. For the first time in his life, he wasn't sure if his intellect could outsmart this force. He had spent so long studying strategies that accounted for everything. But this human child, this species, had shown him that some battles couldn't be planned. Some victories couldn't be calculated. Some forces couldn't be measured. The Admiral reached his command deck, the vast expanse of space visible through the observation windows. He gazed out at the stars, his thoughts still reeling. The galaxy was a place of order, but perhaps that order was about to be disrupted. The humans, so small, so young, had already proven that they could shatter expectations, and they would only grow stronger. It was then that the Admiral realized the magnitude of what lay ahead. If humanity could learn to harness their ability to adapt, to overcome, to trust their instincts in the face of adversity, they could change the very fabric of the galaxy. And if they ever did, they would no longer be the underdogs, the naive species trying to find their place in the cosmos. They could become something far greater. The door to the observation deck slid open behind him, and the child entered, their presence calm but unassuming. They stepped up beside him, eyes scanning the stars with the same quiet focus they had shown in the simulator. "I know what you're thinking," the child said quietly, their voice soft but certain. "You're wondering if humanity is a threat." The Admiral turned, studying the child once more. He had seen many species, many warriors, many brilliant minds in his time, but none had ever spoken with such clarity, such awareness of their place in the universe. "We are," the Admiral said, his voice low, "but not in the way you think. You don't see yourself as a threat, but the potential for what you could become. It's unlike anything I've ever encountered." The child tilted their head slightly, their expression unreadable. "We're not looking to dominate. We're just trying to survive, to learn, to make a place for ourselves." The Admiral nodded, feeling a shift inside him. The child's words were simple, but they carried a weight he couldn't ignore. The humans were not driven by conquest, not driven by the need to rule. They were driven by the need to understand to grow, to push forward no matter the odds. That was the true power of humanity, and it was something that no species, no empire, could easily anticipate or control. As the silence stretched between them, the Admiral found himself understanding something deeper. Humanity's strength wasn't in their military might or their technology. It wasn't in their ships or weapons, though they would surely improve upon those. It was in their capacity to evolve, to adapt to whatever challenges the galaxy threw their way. And that was the one thing that could not be predicted, controlled, or defeated. The Admiral stood tall, his gaze fixed on the stars ahead. The child stood beside him, no longer just a figure to be observed, but a symbol of the vast, untapped potential that humanity represented. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about what would come next. "You are not a threat to be destroyed," the Admiral said, his voice firm but with a note of respect. "You are a force to be reckoned with, and one day the galaxy will understand that." The child didn't answer immediately, but there was a flicker of something in their eyes, something that said they already knew. They were ready to face whatever came next, ready to fight, not for domination, but for a future they could shape on their own terms. As the Admiral watched them, standing side by side, he knew that the future of the galaxy would be different from anything he had ever imagined. Humanity's time was coming, and when it arrived, it would be unstoppable, not through overwhelming force, but through something far more powerful, their unwavering belief that they could always do better, always become more. And with that realization, the Admiral finally understood. The galaxy had underestimated humanity once. They wouldn't make that mistake again.